We got a prayer fire. Roger, I got your find out, buddy. We're gonna be down here. We're not gonna lie. And if nobody can do it, these guys can do it. So just relax. It'll be cool, okay?
We live in a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It is in that environment of high speed, high stress chaos that you as a leader must make decisions, communicate those decisions, then ultimately execute those decisions. Your ability to do so will determine your success or failure. Welcome to Decide, Communicate, Execute. Time to lock and load. Here's Gene.
Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to episode 5 of Decide, Communicate, Execute. If you are a first-time listener, like our announcer said, we live in a VUCA world. Volatility, uncertainty, there's complexity and ambiguity. So how do you function in this world, especially in the business world, where the ground's constantly shifting, where what used to be the norm is no longer the norm? So where do you look for a model that can teach you to do the fundamentals that are necessary not only to survive but thrive in this environment? And I would tell you that our great United States military has that model, and that's what we're about today. You know, you stop and think about it. The essence of leadership is you're where you are today and doing what you're doing today from three components there. It's from the decisions you made or didn't make. It's from how well those decisions were communicated, and ultimately how well those decisions were executed. So I'm going to talk to you today. First, I'm going to kind of review. It's important that you have this model to understand decision making and communication and execution. You know, we do it every day out in the marketplace. We do it every day in our businesses, but having a framework to understand how that's done, how that gets accomplished, is extremely important. So we'll quickly review what we use here virtually every week. I use it and can visualize this in my mind on each decision that I make. It becomes intuitive and becomes a very powerful tool that you're able to use, like I say, intuitively, where it just becomes second nature. And I hope that is the case with you. Here's how we decide. We look around the world or inside our business or at what's ever available there on the shelf at Wally World, and we observe what's going on around us. And then from those observations, and just think about this just for a second, from your driving wherever you are right now, if it was driving home, if it was driving to work, you are constantly doing this cycle, what they call Boyds Oulu. So you're observing what's going on, it's passing through your orientation, you're making decisions and taking actions. And so that is a constant loop that constantly goes on. In the combat world, the quicker you do that inside your opponent's own OODA loop, if you do that faster than they do successfully, you win. Same way on the football field or in basketball. It's this constant observation, orientation, decision, and action. So the sweet spot is actually in orientation. And that's where we're going to park today. I've got a question for you. What big decisions do you have coming up? And I'm primarily talking to business leaders out here, but any type of organization where you've got big strategic decisions coming up that you have to make. And I'm going to share with you some insights on making those decisions. Daniel Kahneman actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work on decision making. He is a Harvard Business School guy, or his articles are constantly being written there, and he talks about our biases. And here's what he wrote in this was June 2011 of Harvard Business Review. The title of the overall edition was How Great Leaders Unleash Innovation. And within this was an article that he wrote that I found extremely interesting. Here's what he says. He says when an executive makes a big bet, he or she typically relies on the judgment of a team that has put together a proposal for a strategic course of action. After all, the team will have delved into the pros and cons much more deeply than the executive has time to do. The problem is biases invariably creep into any team's reasoning and often dangerously distort its thinking. Matt, if you'll go back to that slide before, I threw you a curveball there. But here's what I want to point out for those of you that are watching. If you're catching this in audio only, fantastic. But if you really want to see it, go to YouTube and you can see these slides that I'm sharing here. What happens a lot of times when you're in a position of leadership, especially large organizations, the decision-making model starts with somebody else making an observation, and then they are communicating that observation to you. And it's out of your orientation that you have to make a decision and take an action. So that's why it's extremely important to have that cohesive team that we talked about last week, a team that you can trust, both their character and their competence. So if you'll go on, Matt, to the next one. Here's what he says, and I would challenge you to write these down, especially if you've got some big strategic decisions to make. In the decision-making model, Boyd points out the fact that we make decisions either analytically or intuitively. The vast majority of the decisions we make as leaders are actually intuitive decisions. But what happens strategically, many times we can fool ourselves into thinking that we're actually making strategic decisions, and because it is indeed a strategic decision, or so we think it is, we gather up all the analysis and take the time and banter it back and forth and that kind of thing, that we've actually correctly made a decision. What Kahneman always emphasized was having a process for making those decisions, especially the big strategic decisions. So here's what he says. Question number one that you ask yourself, check for self-interested biases. Now, I know you've never had anybody like this on your team at all, but here's the question he challenges you to ask. Is there any reason to suspect the team making the recommendations of errors? Do you think they might have any errors that are motivated by self-interest? Now, again, I know that everybody on your team is locked on. Nobody's guarding their spot. Nobody has what I call the Chihuahua syndrome, where everybody runs around hiking their leg, marking their spot. But look within your team, when you're making a decision like this, look for self-interested biases. Many times you will see this when you have misalignment within any organization. I'll give you an example. We had a company, and we see this all the time in the work that I do with my partner, Wade Myers at Boldmore Growth Partners. We are coming in to companies, primarily baby boomer-owned companies, that have been around for a period of time, and the owners are looking at an exit in the near future. When I say near future, 3 to 5 years is usually when we like to catch them. But they're really starting to think about this asset that they have. I mean, they've made a lot of decisions. They built up something of value, and now they are looking to go to the next level. Well, many times at that time when we look at that company, we'll have that conversation that we call your baby's ugly conversation after we've done the very rigorous analysis in that company. Then we will strategize and synthesize all the market information, the company information, and their ability to execute, all the factors there, and pull together a strategy after we've done that. Because what I was referring to in your baby's ugly, many times business owners, for the first time, when they get that business valued, it's not anywhere near what they thought it was going to be. And so reality really strikes there, and they have one or two choices. They can adjust their future lifestyle or can really get serious on a focused basis over the next 3 to 5 years on building value in that business. So I give you that background because we've seen this self-bias, self-interested bias come in before. When you come into a company, we had a company where the head sales guy in a certain division was actually compensated on the gross sale, compensated on the gross margin, not margin even, but a percentage of the gross that came through the door. And so this guy, in any type of meeting that we had, ultimately he didn't last, but in any kind of meeting we had, he was constantly trying to protect that. And so readjusted there a bonus plan that was based on the company performing and the company being healthy. And he just didn't care for that at all. Now, it was going to be accountable, not for selling loser junk accounts. And so many times you'll see that, and where that self-interest comes from is, and that self-interested bias is where you have people that have misalignment within the organization. The second thing that Kahneman talks about is check for the effect heuristic. Have you fallen in love with the proposal? I'm telling you, we see this with entrepreneurs all the time. Again, my partner, Wade Myers, has a startup financial model at startupfinancialmodel.com, and it's in 83 countries around the world, and you see these business plans put together and all that, and just the people falling in love with their proposal. No sense of reality, no sense of a reality check. Very much underestimating what it's going to take to get that business off the ground, but they've fallen in love with it. We've all done that. So there's a fine line between optimism and stupidity. I walk that line all the time, every day. But what he challenges you to do is to rigorously apply all the quality controls on the checklist. That everybody doesn't get caught up in what he calls next time there, or step 3, and the third question is to check for groupthink. I've seen a lot of that. It said, were there dissenting opinions within the team? Were they explored adequately? I've seen that, and not that some good can't come out of them, but I'm a little bit critical many times of operations, and you not necessarily operations, but you have these groups of kind of peer-to-peer advisory, and usually it's kind of dominated by one loudmouth in the room who has all the opinion, and everybody else just kind of goes along with it, just kind of gets the groupthink thing going there. And so it's important to make sure, and here's what they found, is that we talked about last week, the whole idea of cohesiveness. Here's what they found, that the more cohesive and the more people really respect and care for each other, the greater the tendency is for that groupthink to kind of seep in to your decision-making process. And so always look for the dissenting opinions within the team. I might have shared with you before, I tell people that I could never be a successful liar because I can never remember who I told what. But one of the things that I would see when I went over in 2005 and then 2007, you might see a battalion-sized movement that was about to take place. And you'd have it led by a lieutenant colonel who's way up the food chain in the military. And when they were laying out and doing the sandbox, where they were actually going through kind of wargaming the movement or wargaming the mission, the commander would always ask for input. And you would invariably get a young sergeant, a squad leader, that says, "Sir, with all due respect, this is going to get us," and it'd usually use a very colorful adjective there, or adverb, in explaining how that was going to result in shortened life for him and his team. Sometimes the commander there would say, "Okay, Sergeant, tell me how we need to change it." He'd take the input, they'd make a change in the plan. There were other times when the commander would say, "That's what we get paid for." But the idea was that there was such a culture of trust between the leader and the led, that the Marines have a concept that they call a moral obligation to dissent. And so that's part of setting up a culture. And if you have a real top-down organization whereby all of your people, are really centralized, you've got your thumb down and you're trying to watch every action that they do, here's where this groupthink will jump up its ugly head. So you need to solicit dissenting views, not people who are just trying to be horses patoots, but solicit dissenting views and do it discreetly if necessary. Next one that you see there is Kahneman says, check for saliency bias. He said, could the diagnosis be overly influenced by an analogy to a memorable success? This is what you see sometimes amongst us old guys. We'll see a new business plan and see an analog or analogy, and we have a tendency sometimes to put that in the file. Hey, we've seen that before. This is it, without seeing the nuances or exactly what's different. And so that's what in the Boyds Oulu loop. Part of that orientation is previous experience. And so that previous experience can be good or that previous experience can be bad, depending on your bias. And so the idea is when you have an analogy, and we're going through a process now on a company that we're launching we've already formed it, but are launching it next year there. We'll be talking more about that later on that I'm really excited about. But we're looking at all the analogs. We're looking at competitors that are side by side, that have a similar type story, although we believe there are none, but every entrepreneur believes that. But we're not taking that for chance. I've been spending today carefully going over every single aspect of people that might even be perceived, even though they do stuff totally different, perceived as competitors. So he says, ask for more analogies, rigorously analyze their similarity to the current situation. Next thing, and boy, we see this all the time. The fifth question, he says, is check for confirmation bias. We have a tendency, we're humans. We do that. When we're looking at data, if you had 12 bullet points and 2 of them confirmed what you were already thinking, and 10 argued against what you're thinking, our tendency is to be blind to those 10. And then to go back totally and focus in on the 2 that confirm our bias. And so he says, are credible alternatives included along with the recommendation? That's the question that you ask. And so you need to always be looking at additional options where we are not in the process of trying to confirm our own existing bias. And next he talks about here is what he calls availability bias. If you had to make a decision, same decision that you're making right now, that's got to be made within the next couple of weeks. If you were going to do that next year, what more information would you want? And can you get more of that now? And so the idea is that every single aspect. When I worked for years and put together the systems for a client that I actually came inside and worked for later on, where we had the company had processed 4,000 SBA loans, and in matching up the lenders with the borrowers, the business borrowers. Part of what they'd have to do is put a forward-looking projection in place, and I always had what I called their RQA, the ruthless questioning of assumptions. And so that's what you want on each assumption that you have in making this decision. You want to make sure there's underlying checklists so you can have the data needed for each kind of decision. On the next one there, he asked for is anchoring bias. You've seen that again sometimes with us old geezers. We'll get do you know where numbers came from? Can there be unsubstantiated numbers? Extrapolation from history, a motivation to use a certain anchor. That's when we get in our mind a certain cost. That's why That's why you young guys out there, and hopefully there's some young folks listening, when you're, going and knocking on the door there to mow a lawn, if any of you young guys do that every day, do that nowadays, but if you do, and they've got you knock on the door of an elderly person like myself, and you want to do the whole lawn, and then you need to make sure that you discuss how much that's going to cost, because they may be anchored in their pricing, back in the 60s, where, you've been out there for hours, and they're going to come up and hand you a $5 bill because, hey, getting your lawn mowed for $5 is what it cost back in the day. And so we have anchoring biases where we get in our minds certain things that we take as just the gospel. And many times unsubstantiated. We've heard it someplace. We saw it on TV, and it becomes anchoring. We see that in the valuation process that we go through with clients. They have in their mind that their business is worth a certain amount because Uncle Billy Bob sold his business and he got XYZX, and so I should be able to get that. No, Kemosabe, Uncle Billy Bob's business was well established. It was in a totally different industry. Cash flow was different. Market was different. His team was different. Everything else, but they're locked into that anchoring bias, and so you need to re-anchor with numbers that are generated by other models and benchmarks, and request new analysis. That's why it's important. Especially for business owners that are looking to grow value, that they really get insights and rigorous analysis of exactly where they are on the map. And then next he says, check for a halo effect. Is the team assuming that a person, organization, or approach that is successful in one area will be just as successful in another? I can't tell you the number. That is why so many times there that you will see NFL players are broke, within a couple of years after they leave their profession, just because you've had success in one arena, even though hopefully you've created that success by a very disciplined approach, by being very devoted to what you do. When it comes to the business world and it comes to investing, many times totally and completely clueless. And that's sad in a lot of ways there. Totally and completely clueless because they're going into another arena based on their previous success. And so this is one of the things that we run in, the kind of the halo effect that we run into with clients that are making major decisions. Because you've been successful in starting a company doesn't mean that you're necessarily successful in taking it to $5 million. If you've been like a client that we've had there that ran it for 38 years and got to $2 million, we came in and in 2 years bumped it north of 10. But just because you've been successful in keeping the doors open does not mean you have that halo effect where you're automatically going to know how to go to the next level. And so we want to eliminate false inferences, ask the team for additional comparable examples. Do not get sucked into the halo effect. And here's the deal, too, that I see all the time. Check for sunk cost fallacy or the endowment effect. Are the recommenders overly attached to a history of past decisions? I can't tell you how many times we see that. A lot of times we see this sunk cost fallacy really embedded into people. You should love and respect your people and grow them as much as possible. But one of the big challenges we have sometimes when we're guiding leaders to take their company to the next level, they'll have Uncle Billy Bob. Now, Uncle Billy Bob came in, and he originally ran one crew when the company just started. And so now this company's grown, and it's located in multiple cities, and they do on occasion international work and all that. Well, Uncle Billy Bob is now the chief operations officer, and the title is highly inflated. And he's moved on. He has not kept up with the degree that when he started with the company was small. Now you got $100 million company, and Uncle Billy Bob is not the guy to really run the thing. You're seeing incompetence. Not that he's not a good guy. You see it everywhere. But many times you'll have that entrepreneur that will not make the decision. Well, we've invested so much into Billy Bob. He's put so much into here. And that doesn't mean you can't keep him on the team, but you need to have a real reality check on, can he indeed execute the job. Then the next one down here that we look at is check for overconfidence, planning fallacy, optimistic biases, and competitor neglect. Man, that overconfidence and competitor neglect, we see that all the time. We have a tendency in our mind to view our competitors as stone cold idiots, and I do the same thing, to where our offering is better than theirs is. Our approach is much better than theirs is. And so when we have these biases and we have this planning fallacy that thinks because we're going through the motion we've actually come out with a plan, that is a recipe for disaster, especially in big decisions. And so have the team build a case for taking the outside view. Use war games. The military now has a concept that they call red teams. And red teams are guys, and I wouldn't want this job inside the Marine Corps, I can tell you that. But they'll actually come in to a command, and their job is to actually oppose everything internally that's going on and to question that ruthlessly and war game that out. And so it takes a certain type of leader that's able to have their decision-making analyzed under a microscope and looked at, but it ultimately produces better decisions. And then 11 there, he says, check for disaster neglect. Is the worst case bad enough? A lot of times we'll look at it, we'll take a decision. Well, on worst case scenario, this will happen. Well, is that the case? Is what you just outlined, is that indeed the worst case scenario? And so as long as you have reality on the worst case scenario and are prepared for the consequences, then you have the ammunition to make the strategic decisions. And then finally down here, check for loss aversion. Is the recommending team overly cautious? We've talked about before up here being underestimating or overestimating our confidence and underestimating competitors and all that kind of stuff. But it can be just as deadly if we're playing a prevent defense. You know, I've shared with you that I had the great privilege to have Zig Ziglar as my Bible study teacher for years. And he used to give the statistics. I need to look up and see what they are today. But he used to give the statistics and show that in the last 2 minutes of every NFL game in the half, there was actually more scoring during those 2 minutes than at any other time span by far. And I don't have the exact statistics, but by far more during that time than any other period of the game. And what was the reason for that? People were in a prevent defense. And so if you've got a team that's playing defense instead of playing cautious, competent offense, then you could indeed have a problem. So I hope that these 12 questions that you ask yourself will help you in any big decisions that you have coming up. And this just gets right in line with the old biblical adage there in the old ancient scripture. Jeremiah said, the heart is deceitful above all things. Every one of us have built-in biases, and we must look at those things and take those into account as we make decisions and communicate those decisions and ultimately execute those decisions. Guys, I'd love for you to get a hold of me. My email is gene.blanton@boldmore.com. Our website's boldmore.com, and the show site, if you want to watch the video on it, listen to this again, is at decidecommunicateexecute.com. And you can even call me direct, 214-289-5000. If you have any leadership or entrepreneurial needs, if your company's too big to be small, too small to be big, if you're looking to exit in the future there, or if you need some leadership development for that next level, give us a holler. We're out of here. Have a good one. Semper Fi.